page 11 to 13. Work, A Deep History, From the Stone Age to the Age of Robots, James SUZMAN, 2020. 0.2 Introduction. The Economic Problem. Part 2. Keynes believed that reaching his economic promised land would be our species' most singular achievement because we will have done nothing less than solve what he described as the most pressing problem of the human race. From the beginnings of life in its most primitive form. The pressing problem Keynes had in mind was what classical economists refer to as the economic problem and sometimes also as the problem of scarcity. It holds that we are rational creatures cursed with insatiable appetites and that because there are simply not enough resources to satisfy everybody's wants, everything is scarce. The idea that we have infinite wants but that all resources are limited sits at the beating heart of the definition of economics as the study of how people allocate scarce resources to meet their needs and desires. It also anchors our markets, financial, employment, and monetary systems. To economists, then, scarcity is what drives us to work, for it is only by working or by making, producing, and trading scarce resources so that we can ever begin to bridge the gap between our apparently infinite desires and our limited means. But the problem of scarcity offers a bleak assessment of our species. It insists that evolution has molded us into selfish creatures, cursed to be forever burdened by desires that we can never satisfy. And as much as this assumption about human nature may seem obvious and self-evident to many in the industrialized world, to many others, like the Uz/Honsi Bushmen of southern Africa's Kalahari, who still lived as hunter-gatherers through to the late 20th century, it does not ring true. I have been documenting their often traumatic encounter with a relentlessly expanding global economy since the early 1990s. It is an often brutal story, set in a frontier between two profoundly different ways of life, each grounded in very different social and economic philosophies based on very different assumptions about the nature of scarcity. For the Uz/Honsi, the market economy and the assumptions about human nature that underwrite it are as bewildering as they are frustrating. They are not alone in this. Other societies who continued to hunt and gather into the 20th century, from the Hadzabe of East Africa to the Inuit in the Arctic, have similarly struggled to make sense of and adapt to norms of an economic system predicated on eternal scarcity. When Keynes first described his economic utopia, the study of hunter-gatherer societies was barely more than a sideshow in the newly emerging discipline of social anthropology. Even if he had wished to know more about hunter-gatherers, he would not have found much to challenge the prevailing view at the time that life in primitive societies was a constant battle against starvation. Nor would he have found anything to persuade him that, despite the occasional setback, the human journey was, above all, a story of progress and that the engine of progress was our urge to work, to produce, to build, and to exchange, spurred by our innate urge to solve the economic problem. But we now know that hunter-gatherers like the Uz/Honsi did not live constantly on the edge of starvation. Rather, they were usually well-nourished, lived longer than people in most farming societies, rarely worked more than 15 hours a week and spent the bulk of their time at rest and leisure. We also know that they could do this because they did not routinely store food, cared little for accumulating wealth or status, and worked almost exclusively to meet only their short-term material needs. Where the economic problem insists that we are all cursed to live in the purgatory between our infinite desires and limited means, hunter-gatherers had few material desires, which could be satisfied with a few hours of effort. Their economic life was organized around the presumption of abundance rather than a preoccupation with scarcity. And this being so, there is good reason to believe that because our ancestors hunted and gathered for well over 95% of Homo sapiens' 300,000-year-old history, The assumptions about human nature in the problem of scarcity and our attitudes to work have their roots in farming. Page 13.